All right, Alice, thanks so much for being on this podcast. I appreciate it.
Thanks for
Just
having me.
yeah, just just to start off, tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you started in the mental health space, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so it kind of goes back a little ways. I was reflecting on this before we started today. Um, I first got into mental health when I was in college. I really didn't think that I would be going into college to study psychology, but it really became a passion of mine once I took a couple of classes. I had some personal experiences. My grandmother had Alzheimer's disease, and just seeing the impact on her and her family, our family, really sparked an interest for me. And so that's when I started working in a lab in undergrad and went on to graduate school to study dementia and dementia caregiving, which brought me to get my degree in clinical psychology. Came to Seattle to do my internship at the Seattle VA, where I got to continue that learning in geriatric psychology. And now I work part-time in a private practice working with older adults as well.
Yeah, because what I was going to ask is tell the audience a little bit about the work that you do, because you work in ge geriatric psychology and your private practice. So could you unpack that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, um, my private practice is kind of because my primary job is a lot of clinical consultation, but not getting to do a lot of clinical work, particularly with older adults. And so the private practice that Nicole and I started, or she's actually had it established for a long time, and I was able to join, really feeds into this love that I have of working with older adults. And so we work with people who have anxiety, depression, who are at the end of life, who may be dealing with a newly diagnosed chronic illness, um, potentially dementia or other kind of medical illness.
Mm-hmm. And so what sorts of methods and approaches do you use when working with this population? Because older adults, it's very different than working with, like, let's say, younger kids or teens.
Yeah, and I'll be real, like I don't have experience working with kids and teens. That scares me. I prefer working with people at the other end of the spectrum. Um, but yeah, I think what's interesting is a lot of the techniques might be similar in terms of the framework, but then you just have to bring a little bit more in, I think, when you're working with geriatrics, because people who have had long lives, have had more experiences, have lived through many different big events, right, in their lives, in our country, as a nation, in the world. And so their experience, the thoughts that they're bringing into certain situations are very different than like you and I might have, right? So
Hmm.
someone who grew up during the Great Depression is going to have a very different perspective of financial stability in old age and what that might look like and how they might approach certain things. So, with working with older adults and geriatrics, it's really important to have that understanding of the world in which they grew up in, the different types of stigmas and roles that people had, right? So, something that I've encountered a lot is with when I work with women who are becoming caregivers of their spouses who have dementia. They grew up in a world where their husband took care of managing the household a lot, right? Managing finances and things like that, making those decisions, because that's just kind of the time period that they grew up in and that they were raised in. And now that role is shifting, right? So there's this huge adjustment from never really being a part of that decision-making process to now having to take that on because their spouse no longer can. So having that understanding of kind of the where they're coming from, how they were raised, right, what their life was, can be really impactful in working with them today. Similarly, there's a lot of theories on aging that I really love, that as our time horizon gets closer, right? And what's really interesting, and I'll kind of come back to this, but they looked at this in people who are towards the end of life, but also folks who are younger, who are diagnosed with a terminal illness. It's kind of the same process that happens where we become much more focused on the quality of relationships, rather than the quantity, and on really focusing on the positives, as much as we can towards the end of life. And so there's kind of that shift that can happen. And so also understanding that, right, and working with that can be really helpful.
Hmm. So this idea of, like, what do you mean, like, the difference between someone who's an older adult and someone who has a terminal illness? So how do those two things differ?
Yeah, so I think it's at least in terms of this theory and this framework, the idea is that just as our time horizons shrink, right? So when you're, in your 70s, 80s, 90s, you have this understanding that the amount of years that you have left is perhaps more limited, right, than when you're in your 20s or 30s. And so the process that kind of changes of that shift to focusing on the quality of relationships rather than other aspects is the same as we might see with someone in their 20s or 30s diagnosed with a terminal illness, where again, because it's a terminal illness, they might see the number of years that they have diminishing as well. And so that shift in focus and importance and values happens there as well. That's what I meant.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting the quality versus the quantity of relationships. I
Yeah.
feel like people my age and my generation are focused on the quantity as opposed to not the quality. Because, with all the dating apps and stuff, people
Social
get
media and
so
all of that. Yeah.
worked up about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So what 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 sorts of testimonials or what have you seen when working with older adults?
Just in general,
Yeah, in general.
I think that for a lot of the folks, so I've worked with older adults in various settings. So when I worked in primarily a medical setting, and with veterans, right, it was a lot of like PTSD, anxiety, and depression. I think what's really rewarding about working with older adults is that sadly, many of them have never been in mental health services before because of stigma or what have you, right? And so a lot of folks that I've worked with, it's their first time in therapy. They're in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and they've never been to therapy before. And so there's an incredible resilience that comes with that, right? That they have lived this many years coping with their own depression, their anxiety, their PTSD, whatever might be going on, and they're still able to function. I think there's so much resilience and strength in that. And there's so much work that we can do when they come at that age, right? Because yes, they've developed some coping strategies over the years to manage, but there's some education and psychoeducation that we can do around like, what is anxiety? What's the function? How can we manage it so it doesn't take over every minute of your life, right? And so there's a lot of reward that can come from that kind of work with older adults. Um, More recently, I think the folks that I've worked with are kind of adjusting to functional change, right? So whether that comes from a medical illness that's changing their cognitive functioning, that's impacting that, or that's impacting their ability to be as active as maybe they used to be. Um, that's a really hard shift, right? If you identify as someone who's always been really active, going outside, really sharp cognitively, right? And then something happens and that starts to shift. It's a big shift in our identity as well, right? And so helping people process that, helping people to dig into different aspects of their identity and like what is still really strong, to kind of help people maintain their sense of self.
Hmm. And how important is it to maintain someone's sense of self, especially at an older age, particularly 60s, 70s?
I would say really important, right? I mean, I think when we're younger, we struggle to find that sense of self and when we're older, and this is just kind of anecdotal, I think because of the changes that people experience, they've had an established sense of self, like this is who I am, this is what I can do for a really long time. And that can start to shift, right? Not with everyone, but it can start to shift when medical issues, cognitive issues may come into play. Or even like losing independence, right? Of I've always lived alone or with, a partner or a family member or a friend somewhere, but now I can't take care of myself as easily, and I may have to move into a retirement community or an assisted living community, right? And so that shift in that sense of self can be really hard, as I think it is for all of us, right? And that shift, if not really addressed well, right, or addressed at all, I think can contribute, again, not in every case, but can contribute to difficulties with mood, depression, some anxiety. And so that's where working with a therapist or whatever you choose to do, right, can really help to maintain that sense of self and then maintain a positive mental health.
Hmm. Yeah, because it's hard, especially at that age, to do that. What I want to shift to focus is sort of the care in mental health? Because oftentimes, when you're younger and and you're navigating your identity, you're looking for mental health services. Is that also the case for older adults, in their 60s or 70s? Or because I feel that there's sort of a stigma or a discrepancy, if you will.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Um, I think the younger generations are definitely much more socialized to the idea of therapy, right? Which is wonderful. So there's less of a barrier to get there. Um, I think with a lot of older adults, I mean, what's interesting is once people have started, they're like, oh, I wish I'd been doing this for a long time, right? Like, this is really
Yeah.
helpful. But that initial barrier is really hard, especially for people who say you're 70, right? And you've been independent, you've managed your own anxiety and depression for that long. It's really hard to cross that barrier and say, nope, I actually need some external help, right? Because you've built up this identity of being really independent, self-sufficient, resilient, which is true in many ways. And that doesn't mean you can't use a little bit of extra help, right? But I think it's really hard to cross that barrier.
Yeah, there's a limit
Get
to what you
support.
can do physically.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
um, my next question is, what have you learned in working with older adults? Is there anything new that you learned during your practice?
I think what I've learned is actually really selfish, and it's one of the reasons why I love working with older adults, and it's to just appreciate and value every single day. Because working with individuals who have experienced just a tremendous shift in their physical functioning or their cognitive functioning, right? It just makes you appreciate what you have and notice like not everything is perfect, right? And I'm really grateful for the strengths and the things that I do have, right? So I think it brings a certain value to just life and the things that we have, that is just different than from anyone else that I work with. And I think there can also be a shift in older age. I kind of mentioned, right, this shift towards the quality of relationships and what have you. But there's also a shift towards just valuing different things as we age and kind of recognizing what's important and what's not. And I think working with older adults has helped me do that even, at my age.
Hmm. Is there anything in particular that you want to learn in terms of something new? Do you want to look at a different population, or is older adults kind of like your main focus?
It's definitely where my heart is. However, I have developed a lot of passion for working with perinatal mental health as well. So, women who are pregnant, who are postpartum, women who are experiencing infertility, who may be going through infertility treatment. That's definitely become something, just seeing in my social circle, and my community. It's something that's not always very talked about. There's a lot of stigma around, say, infertility, right? Or postpartum depression and other kind of postpartum mood disorders. And yet it's so common, unfortunately, right? And so I've really developed a love of working with that population too. So I feel like I'm kind of, as I'm talking, there's kind of a theme of working with people where there's some stigma around like recognizing mental health needs, right? But yeah, that's been an area that I've gone into as well recently and that I really love working with.
Hmm. What has been sort of like your mentor in terms of like getting you to like work with older adults? Is there like a mentor, professor that you've looked up to say, "Hey, I like his work or I like her work. I want to learn more about that."
Yeah, so my graduate advisor, Bob Levinson, was definitely up there. He worked with John Gottman, who's like a big relationships expert, and he and his wife, Julie, have done some really incredible work in the relationship domain. And so when I went to graduate school, well, I was still working on the relationship and couples piece, and so I got to do a lot of work on that too, but was also diving into dementia and dementia caregiving. And so I just loved that work, and I got to be inspired by him, by his colleagues at UCSF who do a lot of work with dementia, and also by my peers, right? By my fellow graduate students in my lab and outside of my lab who were just doing incredible work. Um, and then outside of that, I mean, that was more research focused. Outside of that, I mean, you met Nicole, who was my supervisor when I came to Seattle for training, and we've become friends and colleagues. And she's also been an inspiration too, because she's been in this field for a while as well. And um, just loves the work, right? Of working with older individuals and kind of helping them navigate the challenges that can happen towards late life. So those have been all of my inspirations.
hmm One thing about dementia and Alzheimer's, there's something recently where I learned from a guest that dementia and Alzheimer's are not the same thing. Alzheimer's is a type of dementia.
Correct. Dementia is kind of an umbrella term, and Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. So dementia, I think, is the common name that we use, but neurodegenerative disease is the more professional, I guess, term for it, and kind of and still a large umbrella. And within that, we have many different types of dementias.
hmm Yeah, finally, if I could ask, like, to the people that want to study, older adults, particularly in the mental health space, what advice would you give them? What tips would you give to those folks that want to focus on this population?
It's a great question. Um, I would say, something that I love doing is I got to volunteer in college at um, it was a home where people could go during the day who had Alzheimer's and other types of dementias and just be with each other, be taken care of. And I found that experience really valuable to just get exposure to this population that I was interested in working with. So, as much exposure as you can get, I think if you're interested in kind of a research or clinical science trajectory like I was, then going to your local university and seeing are there any labs or groups that are doing work in this area and volunteering there. I think getting a foot in the door is really important. And so, if there's any way to find someone that inspires you and who's doing work that you find interesting and getting in with them and volunteering in whatever way you can, and then you can kind of grow from there.
Mm-hmm. All righty.